In the middle of a vast land stretching across millions of square kilometers, there is a place where life has to fight every single day to survive. A place where the sun does not simply shine, but seems to burn everything in its path. That place is the Sahara Desert, one of the harshest environments on the planet. During the day, temperatures can rise above 50 degrees Celsius. The sand becomes scorching hot. Dry winds constantly sweep across the land, carrying millions of dust particles. And the most important thing of all is water, something that in many places people can get simply by turning on a tap. But here, water can determine the difference between life and death. For thousands of years, communities living around the Sahara have had to adapt to this shortage. They dug deep wells, they searched for rare oases, they built complex water transportation systems dating back to ancient times. But all of them had a limit. Underground water sources are not endless. Ancient water reserves are slowly running out. And as the population grows, the water demand becomes greater and greater. A question began to emerge. If the ground no longer has enough water, can humans extract water from the sky? A question that sounds like science fiction, but engineers decided to try. And what they created afterward changed the way humans looked at water. When standing in the middle of the Sahara, you might think this place is completely dry. But the truth is far more surprising. The air around us always contains water vapor, even in desert regions. It is just that most of the time, it exists in the form of tiny molecules that the human eye cannot see. In the Western Sahara, near the Atlantic Ocean coastline, a special phenomenon occurs. Winds from the sea carry moisture with them. When they encounter high mountains, the air is forced upward, the temperature drops, and the water vapor begins to condense, creating thick layers of fog. These low clouds do not produce rain, but they contain countless tiny water droplets. Each cubic meter of air can contain millions of microscopic water droplets. The problem is, they are too small, and they are floating freely. Humans needed a way to capture them, like catching billions of invisible diamonds drifting through the air. The original idea was not complicated. No massive machines were needed. No large amounts of energy were required. Only one thing was necessary: a mesh net. Researchers set up large nets on mountain peaks. When the fog passed through, the tiny water droplets collided with the mesh fibers. They stuck to the surface. Then they merged. One droplet, then thousands of droplets. Eventually, they formed small streams of water flowing downward. This principle has actually existed in nature for a long time. Many plants living in dry environments use a similar method. Leaves capture fog. Water flows down the stems and supports the entire ecosystem. Humans are simply trying to recreate that process. The first experiments brought hope. In some dry coastal regions, these nets collected thousands of liters of water every day. There were places where local communities had access to a stable water supply for the first time. But then, an event happened. An event that made many people believe this idea could never succeed. One morning, the wind began to grow stronger. At first, they were just ordinary gusts of wind. But then the speed gradually increased. 20 kilometers per hour, 50 kilometers per hour. Then it exceeded 100 kilometers per hour. A storm was approaching. The water-collecting nets stood on the mountain. They were designed to capture fog, but they were not designed to withstand an attack from nature. The wind hit the flat surface, turning the nets into enormous sails. The pressure increased every second. The metal frames began to deform. The anchor ropes were pulled tight. And finally, they were destroyed. Within just a few minutes, a system that was once considered the future turned into a pile of materials buried beneath the sand. Many investors withdrew. Many experts believed collecting water from the air was nothing more than a dream. But that failure revealed an important discovery. Because the problem was not the idea itself. The problem was the way humans were trying to carry it out. Years later, a German engineer began studying the old failures again. He examined every detail, every small mistake, every weakness in the design. And, finally, he discovered something. Humans had made a mistake by trying to fight against the wind. The wind was not the enemy. The wind was the vehicle that transported water. Instead of building a wall to block the wind, a structure needed to be created that could live together with the wind. A design that could bend with the airflow, allow the wind to pass through, but still capture the tiny water droplets. From that idea, a new technology began to take shape. Its name, Cloudfisher, a special network that could transform invisible fog into a real source of water. But to prove that it worked, the engineers had to bring it to the harshest place, a place where every mistake came with a price. That place was the Sahara Desert. After years of research, the engineers finally completed the new version. It was no longer a flat net that could easily be destroyed. Cloudfisher used a completely different structure. Ultra-thin polymer fibers were arranged in a three-dimensional design. From a distance, it looked like a giant wall standing between the mountains, but in reality, it did not resist nature. It worked together with nature. The wind could pass through the gaps, but the tiny water droplets in the fog were captured on the surface of the fibers. Droplets began to appear, very small, almost impossible to see, but millions of droplets combined could create a massive source of water. To prove this, the engineers chose a special location, Mount Boutmezguida in Morocco, a place located between the boundary of life and harshness. At an altitude of more than 1,000 meters, clouds frequently passed through. But below, there was a dry and barren landscape. This was the perfect place for testing. A morning on the mountaintop, the air was colder, fog began to appear. Layers of low clouds moved across the mountainside. The engineers stood beside the system. Everyone was waiting. If the design was wrong, the entire project would fail. But then, something strange happened. The first water droplets appeared. One drop, then two drops, then thousands of drops. They stuck to the network, gathered together, and began flowing downward. There was no loud noise, no massive machines, only a quiet physical process is taking place. A mountain in the Sahara, it was creating water. What made this technology special? Was it not its complexity, but rather its simplicity? Cloudfisher was based on a natural principle, condensation, when air containing water vapor encounters a suitable surface. Water molecules begin to combine, creating tiny droplets. The problem was, if the fibers were too dense, the wind could not pass through. If they were too far apart, the water would escape. Therefore, engineers had to calculate every detail. The distance between the fibers, the thickness of the material, the angle at which the system was placed. Everything had to be precise. A small change could determine thousands of liters of water every day. The engineers had solved the biggest problem. They had successfully extracted water from the air. But a new question appeared. The water was on top of the mountain, while the villages were located below. The difference in elevation between them was hundreds of meters. The terrain was filled with rocks. There were no major roads, no electricity, no modern pumping systems. If the water could not be delivered downward, the entire thing would only be a beautiful experiment. Once again, humans had to face the limits of nature. The solution came from a simple law: gravity. The engineers did not try to push the water upward. They allowed the water to move downward on its own. Long pipelines were installed across the mountainside. Each section of pipe was transported by hand, across dangerous paths, under the harsh heat. But, once completed, the system operated almost automatically. Water from above flowed downward. No pumps were needed, no fuel, no electricity, only the natural force of Earth's gravity. before the system appeared. Many families had to spend hours every day searching for water. Long journeys, heavy water containers, dangerous roads, especially. Women and children were often the ones mainly responsible. But when water arrived closer to their homes, life changed. Time was freed up. Children had more opportunities to study. Families could grow vegetables. Areas that were once only sand began to show signs of green. But the desert does not easily accept change. One day, sensors detected something unusual. A massive sandstorm was approaching. The wind carried millions of tons of dust. A giant orange wall was moving across the desert. If the dust covered the network, the system would lose its ability to collect water. The fog droplets could no longer stick to the fibers. The entire structure could stop working. When the storm arrived, everything disappeared into shades of yellow and red. Visibility became almost zero. The cloud fissure networks were covered with a layer of dust. Within just a few hours, they could become useless. The engineers had to find a solution, but the answer did not come from machines. It came from creatures that had survived in the desert for millions of years. Scientists studied plants living in extreme environments. They discovered many plants have the ability to clean their own surfaces. When the first water droplets appeared, they carried away dust and dirt, cleaning the surface. Then the plants continued absorbing water. The engineers applied this principle. They changed the angle of the system, used smoother materials, created a structure capable of recovering itself. During the research process, archaeologists discovered something fascinating. The technology of collecting water from fog was not completely new. Thousands of years ago, ancient humans had done something similar. They placed stones, planted trees, created structures that helped retain moisture, without computers, without modern materials. But they understood the laws of nature. Cloud fissure is not an invention separated from the past. It is a combination of history and the future. Modern humans use materials science, aerodynamic engineering, simulation technology. But the basic principle remains the same as thousands of years ago. Observe nature, understand it, and work with it. After the success in Morocco, many places began to show interest. Dry mountainous regions, water-scarce islands, remote communities, all of them could potentially use similar technology. It raises a major question. Could the sky become a new source of water for humanity? Climate change is creating new challenges. Air currents are changing. Fog may become less frequent. Temperatures are rising. The once suitable conditions could disappear. Therefore, engineers must continue improving, creating more sensitive materials, more efficient networks. The story of the Sahara reveals one thing. Humans do not truly defeat nature. We can only survive when we understand it. A wind that once destroyed the system became the very thing that created water. A land once considered lifeless became a testing ground for the future. Today, among the dry mountains of the Sahara, the networks continue to operate silently. They do not create miracles. They only do one thing: transform something invisible into something humans can use. Water vapor in the air, tiny drops of fog, a massive source of life floating above us, and, perhaps, in the future, when rivers begin to dry up, when underground water sources become more precious, humanity's answer will not only be found beneath the ground, but perhaps it will be found right above us, inside the clouds that we once thought were useless.